Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. Greetings and welcome, Michael. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast show. I've been long wanting to have you on the show.
Great to be with you, Bilal.
Now, there's a lot to talk about. You've got two fantastic books that are very relevant for the world today. One is Democracy's Discontent, which you originally published in 1996, but you've since updated it, and it's very prescient when it was first published and is very relevant for today. And then the other book is The Tyranny of Meritocracy, which is, again, a very relevant book for today as well. But before we get into that, I do like to ask my guests something about the origin story. So in your case, when you were growing up or when you were at university, was it inevitable you'd end up in philosophy, sort of political theory, and this kind of public intellectual role that you've ended up assuming?
No, not really. When I graduated university, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. I was always intensely interested in politics, and as an undergraduate, studied politics, political parties, voting behavior, economics, history, a little bit of philosophy, but I didn't really understand it. When I first took some courses in philosophy and political theory in university, I found it abstract, dry, distant from the kinds of things that interested me in the real world. And so I didn't really pursue it. And then so when I graduated, I thought maybe I would be a political journalist. I had done some political journalism while in university. Maybe I thought I might go into politics, or maybe law. Academia was sort of fourth on the list. And then I found myself at Oxford with some time just to study and think, and I thought I'd devote a term to studying philosophy as background to the politics and economics that interested me. But it wound up taking more than a term, I discovered, and so I devoted a second term, and I had a very compelling philosophy tutor, and before I knew it, I had fallen in love with philosophy and never quite emerged. But I always wanted, Bilal, to connect philosophy to the world. And so I've worked in the area of moral and political philosophy with an eye to the way philosophical ideas play out in the lives we live in our public discourse.
No, that's fantastic. And you've done kind of a great work sort of since then. And perhaps we can start with this book, Democracy, Discontent, America in Search of a Public Philosophy. I mentioned earlier, it was published in 1996, which was obviously a long time ago. But, many people think back to the 1990s as almost like a mini golden era, in the West, at least. It was past the Cold War era. The economy seemed to be doing well overall. Yet you wanted to write this book about democracy's discontent. So what was going on back then? And this kind of implies almost that what we're seeing today in terms of the rise of populism has its roots much before the rise of Trump and Brexit and so on.
Yes. What struck me in the mid-90s, Bilal, was that despite the triumphalism and the hubris of the moment, really, because we widely assumed after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union that history had come to an end, that American-style liberal democratic capitalism was the only system left standing, and that the ideological contest was over. And yet, beneath the surface of those heady times, I thought it was possible to glimpse some mounting discontents. Two, really. One had to do with a growing sense of disempowerment, the sense among many citizens that we were less and less in control of the forces that governed our lives. And the second was a sense that the moral fabric of community was unraveling, from neighborhood to community to nation, people felt that they were unmoored, they were not situated in the world, that the sense of belonging, that the social fabric was eroding. So in the 1990s, these two worries were still intimations rumbling beneath the surface. But our politics over the past 3 decades failed to attend to the rising sense of disempowerment and the loss of community and belonging. And eventually, we generated a kind of toxic politics of backlash, where these sources of discontent really became enlarged, deepened to the point where they upended our politics.
And in terms of what causes of this, on the one hand, we've had, if you look at the data at least, economic growth in general has been relatively good. I mean, the US stands out amongst the Western countries on that measure. And then also at the same time, what we've also seen is that it feels at least that more voices are being heard from a sort of minority groups, disenfranchised groups from before. So it kind of seems like there has been progress on multiple different fronts. I should add also technology as well. So how did this come about then? This disenfranchisement and lack of sort of moral sort of compass, so to speak.
Right. Well, I think for a couple of reasons. First, while it's true that there's been, if we look over the past 4 or 5 decades, there has been, during the age of globalization, enormous economic growth. But the benefits of that growth have gone mainly to the top 10 and 20%. The bottom half of our population faced stagnant wages in real terms for nearly 5 decades. And so there was the familiar story about the declining labor share of productivity growth, the widening inequalities of income and wealth. So that was part of it. But there was something more having to do with the changing attitudes towards success that accompanied the widening economic inequalities. During the period of globalization, those who landed on top came to believe that their success was their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserved the full bounty that the market bestowed upon them, and by implication, that those who struggled, those left behind during those decades, must deserve their fate too. This way of thinking about success arises from a seemingly attractive ideal, the ideal of meritocracy, the principle that says, insofar as chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. Now, we know that chances are not truly equal in our societies, despite the strides that have been made. And so one response would be to say, well, we just haven't fully realized the meritocratic idea. We just need to double down on the idea of bringing everyone up to the same starting point and then run the race. And if we could do that, if we could achieve a perfect meritocracy, then the winners of the race would truly deserve their winnings. But is that true? I mean, that's the question that I raise in my book, The Tyranny of Merit. Is the problem that we haven't lived up to the meritocratic ideals we profess, or is the ideal itself flawed? And it seems to me that it's flawed. And the reason it's flawed, we could discuss this if you like, is that meritocracy, it corrodes solidarity. It induces a kind of hubris among the winners and humiliation among those who lose out. It encourages the winners to inhale too deeply of our own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that help us on our way to forget our indebtedness to those who make our achievements possible. And it leads or invites the winners to look down on those less fortunate than themselves. And this dynamic, this way of thinking about success against the backdrop of the widening inequality and the wage stagnation and the outsourcing of jobs, hollowing out many industrial communities, this, I think, has created the sense of grievance and resentment that fueled the populist backlash that we now witness and live with.
Now, I mean, a large part of our audience are like finance people,
Sure.
who feel like they deserve, what they've achieved. They've worked hard. They
Right.
they sort of put the long hours in, and they've achieved the success.
Yeah.
So it's what the counter many people would have is, of course, nothing's perfect. Like democracy is. If you had any choice in political system, none's ideal, but democracy is the least worst. And
Right.
same with meritocracy. So this point first on why not just try to improve it? Because what's the alternative?
Right.
So you could say in earlier eras, medieval eras, people were stuck with their caste or their class of some kind. You were
Right.
serfs, you were merchants, you were aristocracy. So people were kind of stuck within that. So at least with
Right.
meritocracy, it allows for the possibility for people to break out of these structures, and it's not hereditary. So how about that critique of your point here?
Well, that is a powerful argument against what I've suggested. What is the alternative to meritocracy? Clearly, it's important to continue to push for greater equality of opportunity. No one should be held back by poverty or prejudice. But it's also important to remember that equality of opportunity is a remedial principle, clearing away unfair barriers to advancement. It's not an adequate ideal for a just society or for a good society. Now, let me come directly to the challenge you put, Bilal, about what is the alternative? Does it mean going back to aristocratic hierarchy? Certainly not. And surely, if the alternative to meritocracy is allocating social roles and rewards based on nepotism or cronyism or patronage or corruption, meritocracy is a breath of fresh air. So what might the alternative be? Well, let's start by asking, what's morally objectionable about hereditary aristocracy in the first place? It's that it makes life chances depend not on our own doing, but on the accident of birth. Now, what would be the case if we had a fair meritocracy, if we really could bring everyone up to the same starting point in the race? Well, it would be predictable who would win the race. Usain Bolt, the fastest sprinter in the world, he's the one who wins the gold at the Olympics. He would win a fair race. Now, that's partly because he works hard. He trains hard. But Usain Bolt has a friend and a training partner, also a great sprinter. And Usain Bolt acknowledges that his friend trains harder than he does. Usain Bolt is lucky to be gifted, to have athletic gifts that enable him to win the gold, even though his friend gets the silver. Now, let's go back to the folks in finance you mentioned who say, we worked hard, therefore don't we deserve what we get? Well, effort matters. Effort is morally admirable. But do we really believe that effort alone is what distinguishes those who succeed or who win the gold from those who don't succeed or win the silver? Well, not only effort determines outcomes, so do talents, so do gifts, so do advantages that we couldn't even hope to correct for, even if we brought everyone up to the same starting point. So we have to take account of the fact that talent, gifts, those are not our doing, nor is it our doing that we live in a society and at a time that happens to prize and reward the talents we have in abundance. I mean, take an example of another great athlete, LeBron James, the basketball player. Now, he trains hard, he works hard, and yet he's gifted athletically. More than that, he's lucky to live at a time when everybody around the world loves basketball. If LeBron had lived back in the days, the lull of the Italian Renaissance, he could have been just as talented, but he wouldn't have made much or won much acclaim because they didn't care that much about basketball back then. They cared more about fresco painters. The general philosophical point is this: having the talents that enable me to get ahead, that's not really my own doing, however hard I may work to develop those talents. And living in a society and at a time that prizes my talents, that too is my good luck. And once we recognize that, we have a different view about how to allocate the fruits of success. In fact, how to regard our own success in relation to those who may be less gifted or less fortunate than ourselves. I don't know. Do you think that would go any ways toward addressing
I think it goes some ways. I guess what I'm trying to get my head around is, on the one hand, what we are saying is that we need to continue the progress we make on the equality of opportunity. That's
Right.
a given. It seems
Right.
like what we're objecting to is prizing the winners, so to speak. We kind of worship those too much, and we decontextualize those winners. We kind of say, number one, the winners are the ones that should be celebrated, and number two, it was all entirely due to their own doing that they achieved that success. So is this more around what we value as a society? Is that what we're trying to get to? That it's
Yes.
not so much the meritocracy. Well, I mean, I guess it's not so much using merit as a basis to match people to roles, but it's more about what society assigns value to.
Yes. Yes. I think that puts it very well. Merit, in the sense of matching people to roles
Yeah.
that they will do well, that's a good thing. If I need surgery, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it. That's merit. Or if I'm flying in an airplane, I want a well-qualified pilot at the controls. That's merit. That's a good thing, matching people's skills and talents to the roles for which they are well suited. But that's a different thing than the full moral argument or assumption that our success is our own doing. And because that implies that we are self-made and self-sufficient. It's that attitude that leads us to forget the luck and good fortune. And that leads us to forget our indebtedness to those who make our achievements possible. So what to do with the market outcomes produced by the complex mix of talent and effort that people exercise on behalf of various social roles? That's the question.
And one thing comes to mind when we talk in these ways, that I'm thinking about national myths, the stories we tell ourselves as a society. And I'm in Europe, but when I look over at the US, like growing up as well, there's always this story about the American dream that
Yeah.
that anyone, any rung, you can make it to the top. People talk about the immigrant stories. They came from this Irish, Italian, whatever sort of background. They worked their way to the top and they kind of made it. So there's
Right.
this story America tells itself about the American dream, which seems to be a potential unifying story, and which would allow you to reframe, or which could sort of say, actually, it's not so much that um, this is about the people at the top looking down at the people at the bottom, but instead it's more about the people at the bottom saying, I could actually potentially go to the top, because it's the
Yes.
American dream.
Right.
So
The chance to rise.
yeah, it tends to rise. So I mean, does the US have that story, that myth? Does that still exist, or has that gone? And of course, there's the reality of, empirically, is that the case? Do people move up and down, or not?
Well, you've described the American dream as bound up with this myth. Exactly right, Bilal. It's in fact, we Americans have often told ourselves a comforting story that yes, inequalities of income and wealth may be greater in the United States than in many European countries, but we don't need to worry so much about inequality as they do, those class-ridden societies in old Europe, because in America, it's always possible to rise. No one is consigned to the fate of their birth. But that story, comforting though it is, doesn't match the facts on the ground. It's not easy to rise from a low-income family to affluence. A study was done comparing intergenerational mobility rates among OECD countries. And it turns out that the societies with the greatest upward mobility across generations are also the societies with the greatest equality to begin with. The study asked how many generations would it take at current rates of intergenerational mobility for someone born poor, bottom 10%, to rise, not to the top even, but to the median income. And in Denmark, for example, it takes 2 generations. In the United States, it takes 5 generations. From this, you might conclude that the American dream is alive and well and living in Copenhagen. It turns out that mobility is not an alternative to inequality, as the American myth often suggested. Equality is a condition of mobility. And it's easy intuitively to see why this should be the case, because if everyone in the society has access to health care and to good education and to basic living standards, then even those who are not born at the top have a chance to take full advantage of the opportunities to display their talents. And so I think we need to reconsider the version of the American dream we tell ourselves. We should, of course, celebrate those immigrant tales you described, Bilal, of those who arrive, often penniless, and through hard work and talent manage to rise and achieve great things. That's something to be celebrated. But the celebration, we should not let the celebration slide in to the complacent assumption that, generally speaking, it's possible to rise from a poor background to affluence in a short period of time. Let me give one other example. Part of the story is that the engine of upward mobility is higher education. And during the same decades that we've been discussing, roughly the last 4 to 5 decades, we've put great emphasis in political discourse on telling people to go to university because that will be the way in which they will be able to rise. Politicians of the center right and the center left for decades have said, if you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to university. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. We've heard this slogan to the point of incantation across the political spectrum. But if you actually look, a study was done by a group of economists led by Raj Chetty, a colleague of mine at Harvard. They studied 1,800 colleges and universities in the United States, and they asked the following question: what percentage of students in these places arrive from poor families, bottom 20%, and rise to affluence as adults, top 20%? Or do you want to guess what the percentage was?
Well, the way you're asking the question, I'm assuming it's quite
I
low,
know.
but I would kind of guess, I mean, sort of, in an objective way, I would hope it's like 60, 70% or something.
One would hope. It's actually 2%. 2%. Now, this is not because attending university and getting a four-year degree doesn't help you rise and do well economically. But so few students in these places come from poor families in the first place that the percent who arrive poor and rise is only 2%. It's higher education. Here's another way of putting it. Higher education is like an elevator, a very effective elevator, but in a building that most people enter on the top floor. That's why the rate is only 2%. So what conclusions do we draw from this? Well, one conclusion, of course, is that we should do a better job of trying to equip young people from low-income backgrounds to have the educational opportunities they need to compete for admission to these universities. And it remains the case, I should add, that in Ivy League universities in the United States, despite generous financial aid policies, there are more students from families in the top 1% than there are students from families in the bottom half of the country combined. So this explains why, despite the admonition by politicians and political parties to, if you're worried about wage stagnation and inequality, go get a degree, it rings hollow. In fact, what these politicians missed, and this brings us to the sense of resentment that this emphasis, this rhetoric of rising produces, what they missed was the insult implicit in that advice. The insult was this: if you're struggling in the new economy, and if you didn't get a degree, your failure is your fault. You didn't improve yourself in the way we urged you to do. So this also has the effect of deflecting from these parties who presided over the version of market-driven globalization that produced the widening inequalities. It's as if the outcomes were just a fact of nature. And those who fell short, that was their fault, not the fault of the policies that were enacted that led to the wage stagnation and that led to the declining labor share of productivity growth. And so it's no wonder that many working people, many voters without university degrees, would be resentful and angry. And that anger and that resentment was dry tinder for the conflagration of political backlash that we saw beginning in 2016 with the vote for Brexit in the UK, and with the election of Trump in the United States. In both cases, one of the biggest political divides in voting behavior was by education, by those who had university degrees and advanced degrees voted against Brexit and against Trump, and those without degrees voted for Brexit and for Trump. And that pattern has continued.
Now, you did mention university, and of course, the current US administration under President Trump seems to be really targeting Ivy League institutions.
Yeah.
Now, part of it seems to be to do with the claim that they encourage anti-Semitism, which is linked to the pro-Palestinian protests. So part of it is a kind of a political, sort of, we don't want universities to be hotbeds of protests. So there's one. That's one element. There's another element which is to do this elitism, which you kind of talked about, that these Ivy League universities, they're implicitly they're sort of detached from the real world in some ways. There's this kind of elitist types of mentality, the coastal elites and so on. But there's another part of it, which is that universities are viewed as somehow the magnifiers of a certain type of culture, that they kind of, using the kind of sort of the rhetoric of the right here, they kind of are incubators of like woke ideology, and then they magnify these ideologies across the US. So in terms of the morals of the nation, it's universities that sort of create that in some ways. So that's kind of the sort of the attacks. It's at least those are some of the lines of attacks. The sort of the political protests. There's the elitism sort of attack, and then there's the we need to correct for woke ideology because they're sort of culture carriers in that sense. And so there's this attempt to sort of directly influence institutions, defund them, or force them to come under essentially the administration's control. So how do you see all of this from what I just said?
I think of the factors that you mentioned, the second two are the most important. The first one, the concern of the Trump administration with anti-Semitism on campuses it's being used as a tool, really used, in my view, cynically as a tool by a president who, in many instances in the past, was not terribly bothered by anti-Semitism. For example, when people he considered his people were marching with tiki torches in Charleston when he was president the first time. And he famously said these were neo-Nazi marchers with tiki torches. And he famously said, there are good people on both sides. He's had Holocaust deniers to Mar-a-Lago and so on. So suddenly, for this to be the animating purpose of his attack on universities seems a rather cynical account that he's given and some of his allies and supporters have given. But I do think the real question, and this goes to the second two factors that you mentioned, is why it is that for a large part of the American public, there's a willingness to support his attacks on the independence and the autonomy of universities, with federal funding freezes. In the case of Harvard, just recently, $2.2 billion in research funding, most of it for biomedical research, that he's frozen as in an attempt to force Harvard to accept really rather drastic auditing and oversight of hiring, of admissions, and of its academic programs. And so the question is, to what extent does this resonate with the public? And it resonates with not with the public as a whole, but with considerable numbers of members of his party and of those who supported his election. 10 years ago, as recently as 10 years ago, confidence in higher education in the United States, the majority of the public had confidence in higher education and believed, according to public opinion surveys, that they were a force for good in American society. Democrats and Republicans alike, as recently as 2010 up to 2015. And in the last 10 years, that's changed. Belief in higher education as a force for good in American society has declined from around 57% to less than a majority. And among Republicans, now only 19% consider higher education in American universities on the whole a force for good. So there has opened up a partisan divide, and part of that partisan divide tracks education, which brings us back to the anger and resentment of many working people that elites look down on them. And not just any elites, because Trump has an administration full of billionaires, elites in that sense, in the financial and economic sense. But the anger is directed against credentialed elites, academic elites, elites in the media, the professional classes, who now disproportionately vote Democrat rather than Republican. It used to be the opposite. Traditionally, working people were the primary base of support for the Democratic Party, going back to FDR and the New Deal, for the Labour Party in Britain, for the center-left social democratic parties in Europe. But by the early 2000s, this was changing, not only in the United States, but also in Britain and in Europe. So that today, the majority of working people vote for, well, figures like Trump or Marine Le Pen in France, or for Brexit and the Reform Party in Britain. And those with university degrees and advanced degrees and professional credentials increasingly support the center-left parties or the Democratic Party in the United States. And this reversal corresponds exactly to the trends that we've been discussing, Bilal, about widening inequality and the response to that inequality on the part of center-left parties being to tell people, why don't you go improve yourself, get a degree, then you will do better. And this has produced, understandably, anger, resentment, and backlash.
And it strikes me from all of this. There is something that goes back to values. What do we value as a society? Which is one of those kind of soft things that people pay lip service to, but we don't really engage with because we prefer to talk in hard numbers: economic growth, income up, down, technological progress, things that seem hard and solid and real. But values and morals seem to be something from a different era. In your book, your book in some ways was kind of response to John Rawls' theory of justice. I suppose it's kind of a critique of the Rawlsian sort of idea, which kind of permeates our idea in the background, which is that there's no problem with inequality per se, as long as the least advantaged in society get looked after in some way. So, I mean, to caricature Rawls's argument, it's okay to have billionaires as long as they create jobs. And in that sense, it's kind of fine. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm steel manning it or straw manning it or whatever.
No.
So we kind of have that in sort of the background. But the conceit of Rawls was to say that we don't need to then engage in morality. In some sense, this is kind of we kind of make this neutral as possible, and so people then are left to their own devices to define whatever values they have. on the surface, that sounds quite appealing. People are very different in any given society. So why should we have a system that somehow sort of tells people what they should value or not? And so,
Right.
how do you respond to that? I mean, I know how you wrote a book about this, but like, what's wrong with this argument? Is everything we've talked about so
Okay.
far almost like the result of this viewpoint?
Well, you're right, Bilal. I have um, long been a critic of the version of liberalism that John Rawls articulated in his famous book, A Theory of Justice. And there are two issues, and you've mentioned both of them. First, he argues that only those inequalities are just that work to the advantage of the least well-off members of society. And you're right to suggest that that principle could actually sanction quite significant inequalities, provided that they work to the advantage of those on the bottom, and did so in a more effective way than any other principle might. But then there's another part of his argument, which you also mentioned, about neutrality. It's the idea that we live in pluralist societies. We disagree about moral and spiritual questions. We have different notions of the good life and of virtue. And therefore, we should seek principles of justice that don't depend on any particular conception of the good life. And this second claim about neutrality is the claim that I've challenged over the years. In fact, my dissertation as a graduate student back at Oxford was a critique of John Rawls's theory of justice, focusing on this question of neutrality. And I've, in later books, including in my book, Democracy's Discontent, I've argued that this version of liberalism and its aspiration to be neutral toward moral questions, toward conceptions of the good, partly accounts for the failure of liberal politics in recent decades. And shall I try to explain why?
Well, I mean, I guess maybe one way of talking about this is religion. And I'm even reluctant to talk about religion because it feels like such a sort of a topic that can rub people up the wrong way. But one reason I imagine, and I don't know enough about the history of Rawls's sort of theory, but like one reason, and coming from Europe, there's been so much over the centuries, sectarian issues around religion and so on, the Protestants,
Yes.
the Catholics, and all of these sorts of things. And in the US, even, you have the, different sort of religious traditions. And in some ways, like religion is still with us in a very powerful way in terms of how to live the good life. And one reason then for going for moral neutrality is that we don't get caught up in all of these like religious internecine warfare that we could end up having.
Exactly.
Right. So what I'm trying to sort of say is like the biggest source of the good life, I think, in many people's lives is religion. And unless we find a way of trying to talk about religion in some way, it's going to be hard for us to solve this problem of an alternative to neutrality.
Yes, I think you're right, Bilal. And here's the paradox. The attempt, well, let me take one step back. The attempt to seek principles of justice and to conduct our public discourse in a way that's neutral toward moral and spiritual questions. There are two problems. First, it's not really possible to decide many of the hard questions of policy that we face in democratic societies without at least implicitly taking a stand on values or virtues or the good life. I mean, can we really decide, for example, to take one hotly contested question, whether abortion should be permitted, and if so, under what conditions, without implicitly taking a stand on the fraught theological question of when human personhood begins. Can we really decide whether to permit and support embryonic stem cell research if it promises life-saving discoveries without engaging the question, well, does sacrificing a very early blastocyst count, or doesn't it count as morally equivalent to taking a life? I confronted this question when I was asked to serve some years ago on the President's Council on Bioethics, when this was a live question, the moral status of embryonic stem cell research. We can't begin to, or take the debate now largely resolved in most Western democracies about same-sex marriage. That too is a debate that involves moral questions that touch upon some people's religious convictions. Now, my argument is, first, we can't avoid engaging implicitly or explicitly with these debates about values and about the meaning of the good, and in deciding the questions we have to decide as democratic citizens. But there's a further consideration that goes back to the worry about wars of religion that you were mentioning. The attempt to insist that citizens leave their moral and spiritual convictions outside when they enter the public square, and to argue as democratic citizens only in terms that are neutral with respect to those moral controversies, creates an empty kind of public discourse. It hollows out public discourse. It empties political debate of larger moral meaning and purpose. And after a time, people feel that that issues are being decided without genuine public debate. Someone is deciding them, courts or technocrats. But if democratic citizens can't reason from their own moral convictions, it cuts off an important part of what democratic public discourse is all about. People want politics to be about big questions. They want to be able to give expression to their values and their moral commitments in politics. And what happens is, when this is suppressed over a period of time, and people feel that courts or technocrats are deciding these questions, or economists for that matter, there's a hunger to fill that moral void, to fill that hollow space. And invariably, the way it will be filled, if we don't have healthy, explicit debate about moral questions, that moral vacuum will be filled by narrow, intolerant, vengeful moralisms consisting either of religious fundamentalism or hyper-nationalism. And this is exactly what we've seen in recent decades. The empty public space created when we've insisted on a liberal public philosophy that insists on neutrality is the creation of a moral vacuum that invites a backlash, that's filled by either fundamentalism or hypernationalism or both, which is part of what I worried about, going back to our earlier conversation. I worried about this in the mid-90s because it could already be seen. There we saw religious fundamentalism making incursions into public life of democratic societies. And then in the more recent backlash, we've seen the hypernationalism. And we've seen it, interestingly, not only in the US and in Western Europe, we've seen it in uh, East Asia. We've seen it perhaps in China, that this, when a purely market society drives out traditional values and spiritual sources of meaning, what fills that space is hypernationalism. So that's a second practical political reason why I've argued it's a mistake to try to vacate the public square of larger moral meaning.
And just on the public square, again, I'm going to try to sort of air things that it is hard for us to talk about. But
Yeah.
In more sort of so-called earlier times, you often had within families, say the man would be working and maybe the woman would not do paid work, but she'd often, as a result, be building social relations within the community and so on. Or there is somebody who's, has a type of lifestyle which allows them to build bonds in their local community. But in more contemporary society, because everyone's doing paid labor, with more restrictive hours, there's no ability for people to build community of some kind. Often it's in the past, it was often, what was called the housewife who'd end up sort of interacting, building community, go to the church and create that glue to have that space. In the absence of that now, what instead you have is you don't have time for people to build local community anymore. By having two people, within a family, both having to work, and then the kids are in school. So you have this very sort of regimented structure. Um, so I'm kind of bringing gender into this and traditional roles, which is kind of a sensitive topic, within this all. And how do you go about building a community or the public space in this type of arranged society where everybody essentially is working all the time?
Well, I don't think we need to bring back traditional gender roles to shore up the social bonds that have eroded in recent decades. I think that there are other ways we can try to rebuild the fabric of community, but it takes it takes a deliberate project of civic renewal that I think will have to be part of any project of democratic renewal to address the polarization and fragmentation that afflicts social life as well as political life today. Here's one way we might go about it. Well, just to go to the traditional gender roles that you were referring to, I think we have to think about patterns of work life and the balance between work and family and community life in ways that enable everyone who cares about building community to do so without having to revert to the traditional gender roles. But I also think we need to acknowledge that one of the most corrosive effects of the economic inequality of recent decades is the erosion of class-mixing institutions, the loss of public places and common spaces that bring people together from different walks of life and from different economic backgrounds. Increasingly, well, there was a time in the United States where this goes back to the flurry of civic activity during the Progressive era in the early 20th century. There was a deliberate attempt, this is partly also to assimilate new immigrants, a deliberate attempt to create public places and common spaces that brought people together. Public parks, public recreation centers, municipal centers, public swimming pools, public libraries, public schools, which is a project that began in the 19th century. All of these were deliberately promoted. There was a playground movement to create playgrounds in urban areas that would attract kids from rich families and poor families, from immigrant families and from established families to mix. The idea wasn't simply to provide facilities for those who couldn't afford better. It was to create, well, Central Park itself in New York City was designed with this civic ambition in mind to create class mixing institutions and occasions. And what was happened, well, one effect of the widening inequality of recent decades is that those who are affluent and those of modest means increasingly live separate lives. We live and work and shop and play in different places. We send our kids to different schools. So there is very little actual class mixing in the course of our everyday lives. And this isn't good for democracy. Democracy does not require perfect equality, but what it does require is that people from different walks of life encounter one another, bump up against one another in the course of our everyday lives, because this is how we learn to negotiate and to abide our differences. And this is how we come to care for the common good. So reweaving the social fabric, I think, depends on acknowledging, noticing what's happening, and launching a deliberate project to rebuild the civic infrastructure of a shared democratic way of life. And this is beyond the national level. This is in local communities, in downtown areas that have been decimated, to say nothing of the places that lie vacant, where once children poured out without play dates, without a managed schedule, to figure out how to get along with one another.
I mean, hearing you say this, I mean, one thing I kind of think about is the nature of technology right now. And I wonder whether we are in a completely new paradigm where people now, because of the nature of technology, our phones and so on, we live in a digital realm in reality, with screen-based, with people spend a huge amount of time interacting with their screens, through and hence social media and so on. And so the community they form is this virtual digital community, which is very abstract. It's not particularly rooted, but people spend a huge amount of time, living their lives through the screen. And it's very different to the pre-smartphone era, where the technology just wasn't sophisticated enough for us to just be entertained all the time by that. And people engage with social media, then it's interactive. They can express their anger or whatever, and pick feeds that sort of fit their modes of thinking. Given that we have this, and in some ways, the Pandora's box has been opened, is this a whole new paradigm that we have to kind of rethink how politics will be done, because even if those great communal areas were built, they could just be empty because people are just on their phones all the time.
Exactly. Or if they did inhabit them, they would not be engaging with one another, but staring at their screens. And this is a problem. It's an enormous problem, not only for politics, but also for social life and for education, for teaching and learning. So I know that, Bilal, that you ask many of your guests, what should we stop doing? That's one of your questions, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. May I address that one in connection with this question of social media? One thing we should stop doing is allowing young people to have phones in school, in the classroom. And I would extend that, and I do extend that, to my classroom in university. I've discovered that I can't, however good a lecturer I might think myself as being, I can't compete for the attention of my students with the scrolling and swiping that is available to them on their screens. And so I've instituted a no screens policy in my classroom. And students, it's very difficult for them to abide by it. Extremely difficult. And last semester, I taught my justice course, which has over 800 students in a beautiful auditorium. And I banned the use of screens, in part because the course depends not just on students sitting listening to me lecture. It depends on active participation and interaction among students.
I notice you do like to engage your audience. I notice
yes.
in all your lectures, you're always asking questions.
Right, and inviting the participants to disagree with what I have to say, but especially to respond to one another and to go back and forth to develop the argument. And what this cultivates, whether it's in my justice course at Harvard or whether it's in a public event in some place around the world, what people hunger for is the chance to reason together in public about big ethical questions that matter. And this depends on their willingness and their ability to listen. Part of what we've lost in the age of social media and with the rancorous politics that it has helped produce, part of what we've lost is the civic art of listening, by which I mean not just listening for the words, but listening attentively for the principles and the convictions lying behind the arguments of people, especially of people with whom we disagree. We're not very good at listening. And social media makes this hard. And so in my classroom, we struggled to enforce this no screens policy. But although students rebelled, many of them against it by failing to observe it, when they filled out the student course evaluation at the end, many students said they appreciated the prohibition because it enabled them to pay attention, to focus, and to think, and to listen, and to learn in a way that would not have been possible otherwise. And so I don't think we can leave young people to their own devices, so to speak, to the screens. Certainly not in the primary and secondary school, and I would say also not in higher education. So it's a hard battle to fight on one's own. I think we need public debate and institutional support for this, whether it's within a university or within a school district or a school system. But I think that's a debate we need to have. And there's another place where we need to take this seriously. In a less institutional setting, at home, at the family dinner table. Now, I don't know what your policy is, Balil, but I don't like it when if a family is gathered, especially for some occasion or for a holiday or for a festival, and there are people looking at their phone at the dinner table rather than engaging in a family discussion. I don't know. How do you view that? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I'm on the same page as you. I have a family, kids and stuff, and we try to minimize the screen as much as possible. And I'm not sure if we win in that one. We try to sit table together. And weirdly, what I do find actually is if the kids do want to engage with the screen, what we decide to do then is let's watch a movie together. Right. Without our phones. Like back when I was younger, watching TV was viewed as the bad thing. But now, ironically, at least that's better, where you have to concentrate for 2 hours and then you can talk about the movie. And
yes.
you interact with your phone. Because I also find when people watch TV, like normal regular TV or regular movies, they're also they're checking their phone all the time, so they're not engaging
Yes,
in the movie. So that's the
exactly.
one thing we try to do. But personally, as a personal thing, I don't really engage in social media, and I find that from a work or relationship perspective, it's like having a superpower. I find, my I learn so much more because it forces me then to read books, say. It distracts me less. It really is like having a superpower if you don't engage in social media. It's kind of one of those paradoxes, where people feel like they have to engage, but I think it just melts your brain in some way.
Well, I agree, and I also don't engage in social media, and I consider that a superpower and a blessing both. But the movie, I like the example of the movie, the family movie, because this is another arena where if we're watching a movie together, it bothers me if someone then starts looking
Yeah,
at their phone, because even though we're not speaking at that moment to one another, being absorbed together and attentive together in relation to even a movie, that's valuable.
yeah,
And it enables then discussion, as you say, afterwards. And to be absorbed, to
mm,
direct our attention. These are important human powers and capacities to direct our attention to what's worthwhile rather than to what's trivial or merely distracting. And I worry that the that we're losing that capacity, and we're not really helping the next generation develop that capacity. It's a part of freedom, really, to what social by capturing, by commandeering and redirecting our attention. Social media deprives us of an important dimension of human freedom, which is not only about exercising my will, it's also about directing my attention, which is why I think this really goes to something quite deep about, about the good life.
And now I did just want to round off this conversation to where we are today in America. So we obviously have the Trump administration, who in many ways is the most disruptive and radical administration we've had in the modern era, as long as I can remember, at least. In many ways is unprecedented in terms of the mode of execution. Um, in many ways, President Trump is reacting to lots of things you've talked about, in your books, the challenges with sort of democracy, tyranny of merit, and so on. So on the one hand, supporters of the Trump, project, so to speak, would say that, look, this is a much needed reset to the whole US system. Obviously the velocity is very high, but he's basically sort of breaking the old system, and we'll kind of have something better, after that. Yeah, on the other side, people are saying, no, what he's actually doing is that he's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. He's destroying the institutions, the structures, the norms of democracy, and so we're moving closer towards tyranny of some kind, authoritarianism. The populist right has a tendency to move in that sort of direction. So, how do you evaluate where we are right now? Because when I interact with lots of people, many of them feel very concerned. And interestingly, in the world of finance, where there were many people who supported Trump, because of the perceived economic benefits that he would bring, are now questioning themselves about that, whether they do want to support him given his policy on tariffs and the performance of the stock market, to be frank. So there's a lot of anxiety right now around the Trump administration, both within the US, within the financial sector globally. And so what would you say, given everything we've talked about, to that?
I would say that both observations you just made now are true. Uh, it's true that the measures he's taken are many of them are lawless, unconstitutional. It will take a long time for the courts to sort through them all, and it remains to be seen to what extent the courts will check and restrain his overreaching in the direction of autocratic executive power. One vivid example for those of us in universities is his revoking student visas of students who are in this country legally, but who participated in demonstrations that he dislikes, or have expressed political views of one kind or another that he doesn't like. People who have been observing the law, who are here legally, being rounded up and deported, that raises the specter of a kind of authoritarian overreach. And so it may take some time for the courts to rein in some of these measures, intimidating, even extorting law firms that he considers hostile because they represented his political opponents, and doing the same, essentially extorting universities to change their hiring and admissions policies under threat of being deprived of funding for research that they've already received under grants from the National Institute of Health, for example. So this is very worrying. At the same time, this goes to the other part of your observation. Those who worry about the autocratic direction of the Trump presidency, it's for them, for us, it's not enough simply to say we'll take him to court and hope they rein him in. There's a broader political reckoning that needs to occur, and that is those who are politically opposed to Trump and who don't think his solutions to the anger and resentment and the sense of disempowerment are adequate solutions, have to ask themselves, how is it that we created the conditions that led so many people to embrace this figure? What did we, in our policies, permit that led many of our fellow citizens to feel that they are looked down upon, that the work they do is not dignified, that if they lack a college degree, they somehow deserve the struggles that they encounter? What about the widening inequalities of income and wealth produced by the version of globalization carried out with the outsourcing of jobs to low-wage countries and with the stagnant wages that came about? And here's one other source of the anger and resentment. The financial crisis of 2008, the bailout of Wall Street banks, that was endorsed by both mainstream parties. And yet it produced anger across the political spectrum. It led to the Occupy movement and the candidacy of Bernie Sanders on the left. And it led to the Tea Party movement and the success of Trump on the right. That was anger, lingering anger, understandable resentment over the bailout. And what about the outsized role, especially in the American political system, of money in politics? Isn't it predictable that that will increase the sense of disempowerment of ordinary citizens, sense that their voice doesn't matter, especially when the wealthiest man in the world, Elon Musk, is assigned to fire federal workers and cut federal programs. So the challenge for those who worry about Trump and his autocratic excesses and his willingness seemingly to disregard what courts require him to do, the question is, how is it possible to address in a more constructive way the legitimate grievances that Trump and populist authoritarian figures like him in Europe exploit? Because unless we find our way to a politics of the common good, a politics that affirms the dignity of work, a politics that asks how to rebuild the moral fabric of community, that finds a way to give some expression to people's desire to take pride in their country. Patriotism has become almost the monopoly of the MAGA movement. That shouldn't be. Other political parties and movements should also be able to speak a language of community and belonging and national pride, but in ways that affirm the possibilities of living together with all of our differences and disagreements. So I think the ultimate response to the legitimate grievances that have been building up since, well, at least since the 1990s and before, is a bold project of democratic renewal, reweaving the social fabric, rebuilding community, and seeking a more elevated, more morally robust kind of public discourse than the kind to which we've become accustomed.
That's fantastic. I mean, that's a great end to this conversation. I mean, we could go on for longer. And just to wrap things up, what's the best way for people to engage in your work?
Well, two ways. We've talked about, and you generously mentioned that my two recent books, which sort of speak to this moment. The Tyranny of Merit, Can We Find the Common Good, is one, and the other is Democracy's Discontent, a new edition for Our Perilous Times. So the books are one way in which people can engage with these ideas. And we created a free online version of my Harvard course on justice that's available, the entire course, to anyone anywhere in the world who's interested. So looking at some of the online videos and then some of the subsequent discussion-based public events that I've done, we've put much of that online. Another source is a series of programs I've done for the BBC called The Global Philosopher, where we've used technology to video link participants from about 40 or 50 different countries to debate some of the most challenging moral and civic questions of our time, from climate change to freedom of speech to issues of meritocracy and equality that we've been discussing today. So the BBC's Global Philosopher, that's one place to find it, the Harvard Justice Lectures, and the books, The Tyranny of Merit and Democracy's Discontent.
That's fantastic. So I do urge all of my listeners to purchase the books. They're really, really good books, great reads, and very relevant for the world we're in today. So with that, Michael, it's been fantastic speaking to you. Keep up the good work, and good luck with all of your future research and work going forward.
Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed this, Bilal.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.